Welcome back to Goosebump on the Midnight series, where the most terrifying haunted stories are told. Have you ever believed that there are debts from a past life? That the sins of a previous generation could fall upon the shoulders of their descendants? Have you ever considered that some curses are not written in ink, but carved in blood and tears, possessing a power that transcends space and time to find the one who must pay the price? Tonight, we brings you such a haunting and tragic tale. A story called the Twin Soul Blood Oath. So find a quiet corner, put on your headphones, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell on Horror Stories channel as we embark on this chilling journey together. Please support the channel by like the video if you enjoyed it. Comment with your thoughts on the story and its ending. Share this video with your friends and family. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next thrilling horror story. Thank you all for your support. Dr. Ethan Hayes rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the sleep that clung to his eyelids like sap. The chill of the pre-dawn Denver air still lingered on his jacket, even as the sun began to warm the world through the bus window. It had been over 10 hours since he'd left his small, tidy apartment, a cramped space where towering stacks of research books and thick files were his most familiar companions. He was a folklorist, a researcher of intangible cultural heritage, a profession that sounded grand and academic, but in reality, was a series of endless trips to remote lands, embedding himself with local communities. His job was to record, to film, and to try and hold on to the fading values being crushed by the relentless wheel of time. He loved his work, loved the feeling of touching the deep strata of history, of hearing stories that, without him, might be lost forever to oblivion. But this trip was different. It felt more personal, driven by an impulse from his subconscious that he couldn't quite explain. This project brought him to Stone Creek Hollow, an almost entirely isolated Appalachian community perched precariously beside the legendary Serpent's Coil Gorge in West Virginia. The official objective, clearly stated in the project proposal sent to the university, was to study the sorrow songs, the ancient, mournful ballads used in the funeral rites of the people there. It was a niche topic, but deep enough for him to write a respectable monograph, a significant milestone in his career. At least, that was the reason he gave his colleagues, his superiors, and himself whenever he tried to rationalize this somewhat impulsive decision. The unofficial reason, the one Ethan didn't dare admit to himself, was the dreams. For nearly 6 months, his mind had been invaded by a recurring image. Every night, as he drifted off to sleep, he would find himself standing on the bank of a river, its water a brilliant, clear turquoise, unnaturally still. On the other side of the river, a young woman in a colorful, patterned dress, her long black hair braided down her back, stood with her back to him. He never saw her face, only her small, lonely figure stark against the majestic wilderness. She never spoke, never moved, yet from her silhouette emanated a profound sorrow, as deep as the gorge itself. And then, from somewhere in the formless space, the sound of a fiddle would begin. A haunting, plaintive melody, sometimes distant, sometimes near, that seemed to twist into the very core of his soul, causing him to wake in the middle of the night with a heavy heart and a constricted chest. At first, Ethan dismissed it. He attributed it to overwork, to reading too many documents about ancient rites and beliefs. His scientific mind, trained to believe in logic and evidence, tried to analyze the dream as a psychological phenomenon. But its grip grew stronger. The sorrow of the anonymous girl in the dream seeped into him in a strange way, haunting him even in his waking hours. And then, the strangest thing happened. While searching for materials for his next project, the name Stone Creek Hollow and images of the Blackwater River suddenly appeared on his computer screen. Ethan's heart stopped. The turquoise river, winding between two towering cliffs, it was a terrifyingly perfect match for the scene in his dreams. This was no longer a random coincidence conjured by a tired brain. The name Stone Creek Hollow, once a foreign place, suddenly became a thorn lodged in his mind, a silent call urging him to go there, to find an answer. He closed his laptop and stepped out onto the balcony. The Denver night was still noisy and bustling, but in Ethan's heart, there was only the image of the mountains and the sound of that mournful fiddle. He knew he had to go. Not as a researcher, but as a man searching for the solution to his own haunting. Chapter 2: The Devil's Backbone. The 16-seater shuttle bus groaned as it crawled around each hairpin turn. On one side was a sheer cliff face of gray limestone, jagged like the teeth of some prehistoric monster. On the other, a bottomless abyss, its depths hidden by a thick, milk-white fog. The Devil's Backbone Pass, connecting the flatter lands to the high mountain counties, certainly lived up to its reputation as one of the most treacherous roads in the region. It snaked through the endless mountain ranges, like the spine of a giant stone dragon. After more than 10 hours crammed into the tight space, Ethan's body was exhausted, but his mind was strangely alert. He stared out the window at the dramatically changing scenery. The flat plains of the heartland were gradually replaced by rolling hills, then earthy mountains, and finally, the majestic, stony spine of the Appalachians. This was it. Not the romantic, picturesque Appalachia from tourist postcards or travel blogs. This was a raw, wild place, hiding something primal, a latent power that made Ethan's chest tighten. The barren, gray limestone peaks seemed lifeless, but Ethan had the feeling they were watching him, judging the stranger who dared to intrude upon their domain. On the bus, besides him and a few other backpackers, were several locals heading home. They spoke to each other in a dialect thick with unfamiliar words, occasionally glancing at him not with curiosity, but with a distant, reserved look. An old woman in traditional, homespun clothing sat in the row ahead, occasionally turning to look at him with eyes that were cloudy but sharp. Every time their gazes met, Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Sleep finally came, but it was fitful and restless. In his dream, the sorrowful fiddle music returned, this time closer, clearer, blending with the sound of the wind whistling through the bus's window sills to create a ghostly symphony. He saw the girl by the river again, but this time, the mist seemed to have thinned. He felt that if he tried just a little harder, he could see her face. But every time he tried to step closer, an invisible wall blocked his path. He woke with a start as the bus screeched to a halt. Harpersburg Junction, the driver announced. A few tourists got off, carrying cameras and excited smiles. Ethan remained seated. Stone Creek Hollow was still further on. The bus rolled on, deeper into the core of the limestone plateau. The road became even more precarious. There were stretches where the engine roared as the bus inched up a steep incline, its wheels mere inches from the cliff's edge. Through the window, Ethan could see the turquoise Blackwater River far below, as thin as a thread. His heart pounded. That was it. The river from his dreams. Finally, after nearly 2 more hours, the bus stopped at a dusty, desolate crossroads amidst an endless expanse of rock. A few dilapidated houses with corrugated metal roofs and a small general store were all that constituted the town center. "This is your stop, mister," the driver said, turning around, his mountain accent thick. "This is the turnoff for Stone Creek Hollow. You'll need to take a bike the rest of the way, about 10 miles on a dirt road. Your guy's right over there." Chapter 3: The Girl with the Modern Smile. Ethan swung his heavy backpack off the bus. The sharp cold of the highlands immediately bit into his skin, a stark contrast to the humid heat of the city. The air here was thin and clean, carrying the scent of earth, stone, and some unfamiliar herb. He stood shivering for a moment, trying to acclimate to the sudden change in temperature. Waiting for him next to a battered old dirt bike was a young local girl, small-framed but nimble. What surprised Ethan was that she wasn't wearing the traditional clothing he had imagined. Instead, she wore tight jeans and a modern windbreaker, her long black hair tied neatly in a ponytail. Only her bright, clear eyes and sun-weathered skin revealed she was a child of the mountains. The girl smiled and approached him, a radiant smile that revealed two charming dimples. "You must be Mr. Hayes, right? I'm Maya. Maya Blackwood. My father is the community elder. He asked me to come pick you up. I'll be your guide and help you out during your time in Stone Creek Hollow." Maya spoke perfect English, with only a slight, charming lilt to her accent. The young girl's cheerful, open demeanor somewhat dispelled the heavy, foreign feeling that had been enveloping Ethan. "Hi, Maya. Thanks for waiting for me," Ethan replied, smiling back. "I appreciate it. It's no trouble at all. The whole hollow is excited to have an important visitor from the city," Maya said. But as she spoke, a fleeting, indescribable expression crossed her eyes, a moment's hesitation that then vanished. Ethan wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. "Is the road to the hollow difficult?" he asked, looking at the narrow, winding dirt path that disappeared behind a mountainside. "Not too bad," Maya laughed again, her smile innocent. "Just a little bumpy. Just hold on tight to the back of my bike, and you'll be fine." Ethan strapped his large backpack onto the rear rack, trying to secure it tightly. He climbed onto the bike, his hands gripping the worn, torn seat. Maya's bike, though it looked old, started with a sweet purr. She revved the engine a few times, and the bike lurched forward, plunging onto the dirt road. The dirt road into Stone Creek Hollow was a brutal challenge for a city person like Ethan. It wasn't just a little bumpy, as Maya had said. It was a symphony of shaking, jarring, and lurching. Maya's rickety bike navigated impossibly steep slopes and then plunged down dizzying descents. The wheels slipped in treacherous mud puddles and then bounced violently over jagged, rocky sections. Ethan had to tense his entire body, his hands clamped to the back of the seat, at times feeling as if both he and the bike were about to be flung into the abyss. But Maya was different. She handled the bike with expert skill, her small body seeming to merge with the machine. She maneuvered through obstacles with a light, precise touch, occasionally turning back to smile at Ethan. "You doing okay?" The deeper they went, the more wild, majestic, and utterly silent the landscape became. The steep mountain walls on either side of the road rose like the ramparts of a forgotten world. Occasionally, they passed through small valleys where barren, terraced fields clung to the mountainsides like scars. Then, the first houses of Stone Creek Hollow appeared. Old log and stone cabins, characteristic of the region, sat silently on the mountainsides, hidden behind groves of old bamboo and tall, straight fir trees reaching for the sky. They weren't clustered together but scattered far apart, creating a sense of a solitary, resilient, and somewhat resigned existence. The silence was so profound that Ethan could clearly hear the wind whistling through the rocks, the crunch of the tires on the gravel, and his own breathing. This was it. Stone Creek Hollow. A world almost completely cut off from the outside. Stone Creek Hollow greeted him with an unusual silence. A silence not of peace, but of vigilance. As Maya's bike entered the main path of the hollow, the few people they encountered on the road all stopped. An old man, sitting on his porch warming himself in the sun, his calloused hands clutching a corncob pipe, looked up. A woman, diligently embroidering by a window, her nimble hands suddenly froze. Even a group of children playing with wooden tops in a clearing fell silent, turning to stare at the stranger. Their eyes didn't hold the curiosity or hospitality one usually finds in rural areas. It was a look of scrutiny, of caution, and, it seemed to Ethan, he could even sense a hint of something like fear or pity. Maya called out a cheerful greeting to them in her local dialect. But the only response she received was a few barely perceptible nods. Then they quickly turned away, resuming their work as if Ethan's presence was something not to be focused on for too long. The warm welcome Maya had spoken of back at the crossroads seemed non-existent here. The villagers don't seem used to strangers, do they? Ethan asked softly, leaning close to Maya's ear to be heard over the engine. Maya paused for a second. Ethan could feel the tension in her shoulders. The smile on her lips faded. "Yeah," she replied, her voice a little softer. "We don't get many outsiders staying for long. Don't mind them." Maya's answer seemed reasonable, but Ethan felt something was wrong. This level of wariness was beyond normal. The cabin Maya had arranged for Ethan was an empty wooden structure at the far end of the hollow, completely separate from the other houses, its back against a gentle slope. It was surrounded only by trees and lone boulders. "This was my uncle's place," Maya explained as they stopped the bike. "He's working down in the city, so it's empty. You can stay here for some peace and quiet. My house is just up there. If you need anything, just shout, and I'll hear you." The cabin was quite clean, likely tidied up carefully by Maya and her family before his arrival. The earthen floor was packed flat, the wooden walls well sealed. But as soon as he stepped inside, Ethan felt a damp, chilling air, the cold of a place long devoid of human presence. After helping Ethan set his backpack and a few personal items in the inner room, Maya quickly left, promising to bring him dinner later. She departed in a hurry, as if she didn't want to stay in the cabin any longer than necessary. Ethan was left alone with the enveloping silence, broken only by the chirping of insects and the sighing of the wind outside. He walked around the cabin to observe it. It had a typical three-room layout, with the central room being the most formal, used for receiving guests and for the family mantelpiece. The two side rooms were bedrooms. The mantelpiece was on the main wall, opposite the entrance. It was simple, just a heavy wooden beam. What caught Ethan's attention was a small, rectangular wooden box placed on it, next to some old, empty canning jars. The box was carved with strange swirling patterns and geometric shapes he had never seen in any documentation of Appalachian art. It looked very old, the wood darkened by time, yet it was spotlessly clean, as if someone wiped it every day. Such meticulous care for an item in an abandoned house was strange. Curious, Ethan reached out to touch it, but a sudden, piercing cold shot through his fingertips, making him recoil. Probably just the cold air in the house, he told himself. He entered the bedroom designated for him. The furniture consisted only of a low wooden bed, a small table, and a stool. The window was a small square opening that looked out onto the hill behind, where the shadows of the fir trees were beginning to lengthen in the twilight. This place was truly too quiet. His first night in Stone Creek Hollow was a sleepless one. When the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, darkness fell upon the valley swiftly and completely. There were no electric lights, only the faint glow of a crescent moon filtering through the clouds. The wind from the Serpent's Coil Gorge began to howl, seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls, creating mournful, wailing whistles. The whole cabin seemed to groan under the force of the wind. Ethan lay on the hard bed, wrapped in the thick quilt Maya had brought, but he could still feel the cold seeping into his bones. He tried to close his eyes, forcing himself to sleep after a long, tiring day, but it was impossible. His mind was as taut as a violin string. Every sense seemed to be heightened in the darkness and silence. He could hear the termites gnawing at the wood, a gecko clicking its tongue somewhere in the rafters, and the relentless screaming of the wind. And then, he heard it. Another sound, not the wind, not insects. It was the sound of footsteps. Very light, but steady, as if someone was walking in the main room, right outside his bedroom. Bare feet on the packed earth floor, a soft, slow shuffling. Ethan held his breath, listening, his heart beginning to pound. Could it be Maya bringing him something else? But it was too late, and she would have knocked, not entered so silently. An animal? A stray dog or cat? No, the rhythm was human. The footsteps stopped, right in front of his bedroom door. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the sound. Ethan felt his heart was about to leap out of his chest. He had the distinct feeling that on the other side of the thin wooden door, someone was standing, listening, staring at him through the darkness. His throat was dry, he tried to call out, but no sound could escape. A minute passed, then two. As heavy as a century. There was no further movement. Only the wind, still shrieking its mournful tune. Maybe he had misheard. Maybe it was just the imagination of an overtired mind, a mind obsessed with strange dreams. He tried to reassure himself with logical explanations. But the feeling of that presence lingered, cold and menacing. That night, he lay wide awake, eyes staring into the darkness until the first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the door. The next morning, as the sun rose higher and the fog began to dissipate, the fear of the previous night seemed to lessen. Ethan chided himself for being too sensitive. He decided to push aside the unsettling thoughts and focus on his work. He began by going with Maya to meet some of the village elders, those who were said to still remember the old sorrow songs. But their reactions were even stranger than the wariness he had felt the day before. The first person they met was an old man with a weathered face, who was weaving a wicker basket on his porch. When Maya introduced them and Ethan began to ask about the sorrow songs, the smile on the old man's face vanished. He waved his hands frantically, shaking his head, and muttered something in his dialect with a look of terror. He didn't even dare to look directly at Ethan, just kept his head bowed over his half-finished basket. The second was an old woman spinning wool. At first, she was friendly, inviting them for a drink of water. But when she heard the word sorrow songs, her expression changed instantly. She hastily put down her cup, stood up, and went straight into her house, slamming the door shut, leaving Ethan and Maya stunned in the yard. The third, a respected elder, had an even more severe reaction. He not only refused but looked at Ethan with a mixture of anger and pity, then spoke a long stream of dialect to Maya. On the way back, Ethan couldn't hide his disappointment and confusion. What did they say, Maya? Why did everyone react like that? Maya walked beside him, her head down, staring at the dirt path. She seemed very uncomfortable. Mr. Hayes. She hesitated. I'm sorry. Maybe this topic is a bit sensitive. Sensitive how? I'm a researcher. I just want to learn about and preserve your culture. I mean no harm. Maya sighed. I know. But they say those are the songs of the dead. The voices of ghosts. The living shouldn't mention them, shouldn't sing them. It brings bad luck. Bad luck? Yes. They say that to speak the names of those songs is to call the spirits of the dead back. It will bring disaster to both the singer and the listener. especially to a stranger like you." Maya stopped, looking directly into Ethan's eyes, her voice serious. "Please try to understand them. There are taboos here. I think you should choose a different topic." Maya's words were like a bucket of cold water on Ethan's enthusiasm. He had come here for the sorrow songs, but now, the door to that knowledge had been slammed shut in his face. Not because people didn't know, but because they were too afraid to speak. That fear wasn't ordinary superstition. It was a terror deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness of the community. And it was definitely connected to the silence and the wary glances he had received. Frustrated by his inability to access his sources, Ethan decided to take a walk alone around the hollow in the afternoon to clear his head. He didn't go towards the center of the village but followed a small trail leading down into the valley, where a small stream gurgled. The scenery here was beautiful and peaceful. The terraced fields, barren after the harvest, were layered like golden steps leading up to the sky. A gentle afternoon breeze carried the earthy scent of damp soil. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to push the negative thoughts out of his mind. As he rounded a bend, his eyes were drawn to a strange sight. Standing alone on the hillside on the other side of the stream, under the shadow of a giant, ancient sycamore tree, was a dilapidated stone cabin. The sycamore was so massive that its canopy covered a large patch of ground, its gnarled, leafless branches reaching up to the gray sky like skeletal, mournful arms. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for a very long time. The slate roof was broken and had collapsed in several places. The stone walls were cracked and mottled, revealing the timber frame within like a skeleton. It stood there, silent and sorrowful, a mute witness to a tragedy forgotten by time. A professional curiosity urged Ethan to get closer. He waded through the shallow, ice-cold stream. The closer he got to the cabin, the more a chilling coldness invaded him, a cold completely different from the weather. The air around the cabin seemed to thicken, becoming eerily still. The gurgling of the stream and the rustling of the wind seemed to be swallowed by this heavy silence. At the base of the ancient sycamore was a large, flat stone, looking like a natural altar. The stone was covered in a thick layer of green moss, but Ethan could faintly see worn carvings, perhaps the remnants of some past ritual. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to step over the rotten threshold and go inside. Inside, the house was empty and desolate. There was no furniture left, only a cold, lonely hearth in the middle of the room and thick black soot clinging to the walls. The faint afternoon light filtered through holes in the roof, creating hazy shafts of light in the musty space. Ethan stepped into the inner room, which was likely once a bedroom. And then, he saw them. What drew his attention were the countless scratch marks on the plaster and lath wall. Hundreds, thousands of scratches, crisscrossing, overlapping, gouged deep into the plaster. They looked as if they had been made by someone in a fit of madness, pain, and ultimate despair, using their own fingers to claw at the wall. Some of the marks had faded with time, the exposed lath darkened. But some looked quite new, the plaster inside still lighter than the surrounding area, as if they had only recently been made. Ethan's heart suddenly clenched. He could feel the anguish that seemed to still linger in these marks. Who had lived here? What had happened in this house? Suddenly, an icy wind blew from nowhere, though the air outside was still. The wind whistled through the gaps, causing the one remaining dilapidated window shutter to slam against the wall. Ethan spun around, startled. And he heard a whisper. Very soft, very light, but clear, right next to his ear. A female voice. A mournful voice, as fragile as smoke and full of despair. Ethan stumbled back in terror, his back hitting the opposite wall hard. The hair on his body stood on end. He strained his eyes, scanning the empty, dusty room. There was no one there. Only him and the bone-chilling cold seeping into every cell. The whisper came again, this time clearer, colder, as if the speaker was right behind his neck, breathing an icy breath onto his skin. A primal, instinctual fear he had never known in his life rose from his stomach, choking his chest. All reason, all scientific skepticism, vanished. He didn't think anymore, he acted on the sole instinct, run. He turned and fled headlong out of the abandoned house, tripping over the rotten threshold, then scrambling back up and running again. He ran up the slope without daring to look back once. He felt as if something invisible and cold was chasing him, its deathly breath on his neck. He ran and ran until he reached his own cabin at the edge of the hollow. He slammed the door, bolted it, and leaned against it, panting, his heart hammering as if it would burst from his chest. That wasn't a hallucination. That sound, that feeling, they were too real. Stone Creek Hollow didn't just have taboos. It had something that was truly present. A tormented soul. And it seemed to have become aware of his presence. That evening, Maya brought dinner over to Ethan as promised. She walked into the cabin, calling out cheerfully, but fell silent when she saw the look on his face. "Mr. Hayes, are you unwell? You look terrified." Ethan was sitting on the stool, his head in his hands, his body still trembling slightly. His face was as white as a sheet, his eyes wide, staring at some indefinite point in space. He looked up at Maya, hesitating for a moment. He didn't want to tell her, afraid she would think he was crazy, or worse, become even more frightened. But the terror was still thick in his chest. He needed to tell someone, needed an explanation. "Maya," he began, his voice hoarse. "The abandoned cabin down in the valley, the one under the ancient sycamore tree. Whose house is that?" As soon as Ethan's question finished, the tray in Maya's hands trembled. With a clink, the utensils fell to the floor. Her face instantly turned pale, her eyes wide with utter horror. "Oh my God! You went inside?" She stammered, her voice trembling. Maya's reaction confirmed Ethan's fears. "Yeah, I was just curious and passed by. Is there something wrong with that house?" Maya quickly placed the tray on the table, then glanced around as if afraid someone was listening. She pulled a stool over to sit opposite Ethan, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Mr. Hayes, listen to me. Promise me you will never, ever go near that house again. It's haunted. That was Ilara's house." "Ilara?" Ethan frowned. The name sounded familiar, as if he'd heard it somewhere before. "Yes. Ilara Sparrow. The girl who died a wrongful death in that very house. Almost 60 years ago." And then, under the flickering light of an oil lamp, in the cold cabin amidst the wild mountains, Maya began to tell the story. Her voice trembled, a mixture of fear and deep sorrow. Long ago, Ilara Sparrow was the most beautiful girl not just in Stone Creek Hollow, but in the entire mountain region. People compared her beauty to the finest mountain laurel blooming in spring, pure, radiant, and full of life. She had long, jet-black hair, eyes as clear as spring water, and a smile that could melt the hardest of hearts. She was in love with Silas Crow, a poor but kind and strong young man who played the fiddle better than anyone in the hollow. Their love was pure and deep, and the whole community supported them, seeing them as a perfect match. They had pledged themselves to each other, waiting for the day Silas had saved enough for a small dowry to formally ask for Alara's hand. Before them was a horrific scene. Leland Thorne lay dead on the floor, his eyes bulging, his face purple, with deep bruises on his neck as if he had been strangled by some superhuman force. And Alara, she was still sitting on the bed in her deep red wedding dress, her hair disheveled, covering most of her face. She wasn't dead, but she was no longer among the living. When someone lifted her hair to see, her eyes were empty, soulless, devoid of any spark of life. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't cry, just sat motionless like a stone statue. And on the walls around the bed were countless scratch marks, deep, bloody gouges, as if she had used her own fingernails to claw at the walls in a fit of ultimate pain and madness. After that day, Silas Crow vanished from the hollow without a trace. No one ever found any sign of him, as if he had dissolved into thin air. As for Alara, she lived as a shadow in her own home for a few more years. She didn't eat, didn't speak, just sat in one spot, staring into space. Then, she too died in silence. But the tragedy didn't end there. Alara's family, who had accepted Leland Thorne's money to force their daughter into marriage, suffered one disaster after another. Her father fell from a horse and died while working in the fields. Her brother contracted a strange illness that withered his body until he died. The entire family was wiped out within a few years. The villagers said that the vengeful spirit of Leland Thorne, having died a violent death, could not move on. And the soul of Alara, bound by the cruel blood oath, had become an incredibly fierce demon, taking revenge on everyone who had caused the tragedy in her life. The house was abandoned, overgrown with weeds, and no one dared to go near it. They say, Maya finished her story, her voice filled with fear, that Alara's spirit is still there, in that house, around that sycamore tree. She's still waiting for Silas to return. And she hates all strangers, especially men from the city, like Leland Thorne. Ethan sat frozen. Every word of Maya's story was like a needle piercing his mind. It explained everything. The scratches on the wall. The mournful whisper demanding blood back. The villagers' fear when hearing about the funeral songs. And him, a man from the city, who had come here. Could it be? That whisper, that demand for blood, was meant for him? But why? What connection did he have to a tragic story from 60 years ago? The nightmare that night was more horrific than all the previous dreams combined. He didn't dream of standing by the river. He dreamed he was lying in this very bed, in this very room. And the girl in the Appalachian dress was here, in his room. She stood at the foot of the bed, silently staring at him. Wind blew through the cracks in the door, making her long black hair flutter, alternately hiding and revealing her face. And this time, he could see her. A beautiful, oval face, but deathly pale, without a drop of blood. Her thin lips were colorless. And her eyes. Her eyes were black, deep, and as empty as the void. But from their depths, a blazing hatred, a resentment that had been suppressed for 60 years, swirled into a storm, aimed directly at him, freezing his very soul. It was Alara. She slowly raised an arm, her slender fingers as white and blue as if carved from ice. She pointed directly at Ethan. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Yet Ethan could hear every word echoing in his head, as cold and sharp as a blade of ice. You are one of them. His blood. It still flows in you. You must pay. Ethan bolted upright, his mouth open, trying to scream but no sound came out. Sweat soaked his shirt and blanket. He gasped for breath, his heart racing wildly in his chest. The room was still dark and silent. But the feeling of Alara's presence still lingered, the coldness of her gaze seemingly still fixed upon him. His blood? Who was he? Leland Thorne? It was absurd. A crazy coincidence. His last name was Hayes. How could he possibly have any blood relation to a man named Thorne from 60 years ago? Trembling, Ethan fumbled for his phone on the table and turned on the flashlight. He needed light, needed something tangible from the real world to cling to pull himself out of the swamp of fear. The flashlight beam trembled as it swept around the room, across the wooden walls, banishing the darkness. And then, it stopped on the wall opposite his bed. His heart stopped for the second time that night. On the wooden wall, which he was certain had been perfectly smooth when he went to bed, there were now 5 brand new scratch marks, gouged deep into the wood, splintering it into tiny fibers. 5 parallel scratches. They looked exactly like the marks of a hand clawing at the wall in utter desperation. Fear finally broke through all his remaining barriers of reason. This was not a coincidence. This was not a psychological suggestion. This was not a dream. There was something in Stone Creek Hollow. Something evil, ancient, powerful, and full of hate. And it had noticed him. It had marked him. The research project on the sorrow songs now seemed faded and meaningless. There was another, darker secret, a terrifying curse waiting for him to uncover. Or waiting to devour him. Dawn came late to Stone Creek Hollow. The sun struggled for a long time to escape the grip of the towering peaks and the persistent fog that clung like a shroud. The faint light of the new day shone into the room but couldn't dispel the cold and darkness that had congealed overnight. For Ethan Hayes, the night wasn't over. The nightmare had spilled into the real world. He sat huddled on the bed, his back against the cold wooden wall, his eyes fixed on the 5 scratch marks on the opposite wall. They were not an illusion. They were there, sharp, cruel, a message written in the language of violence and despair. They were like 5 gashes on his own skin, stinging and horrifying. The social scientist's reason screamed in protest. He tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe he did it himself in his sleep, a form of sleepwalking caused by extreme stress. Yes, that must be it. He was too stressed, haunted by Maya's story and the atmosphere of the village. Or maybe it was a cruel prank by someone in the village, someone who wanted to scare him away. But deep down, a more primal instinct told him that all these self-assurances were lies. He slowly stood up, his bare feet cold on the earthen floor, and approached the wall. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the scratches. The wood was torn open, the splinters still fresh and sharp. He could feel the ferocity in every gouge. No, this was not something he could have done in his sleep. And it was certainly not a prank. The cold words echoed in his head, his blood. It still flows in you. The empty, hateful eyes in the dream, and these 5 scratches. They were an undeniable chain of messages, a verdict that had been sealed. An intense urge rose in Ethan, run. Get out of here. Immediately. He would pack his things, hike out of this cursed valley if he had to, catch a ride, a bus, anything to get back to the noisy safety of Denver. Forget the Sorrow Songs project, forget Stone Creek Hollow like a terrible nightmare. Forget everything. He began to act on survival instinct. He pulled out his backpack, hastily stuffing clothes, books, and his camera inside in a chaotic mess. His hands trembled, his mind was blank, with only one goal: escape this place. But then, as his hand touched his research notebook, the image of Alara's eyes in the dream returned. Red-rimmed, full of hatred. And that sentence, that curse, echoed in his mind again.
You must pay.
It wasn't an empty threat. It was a sentence. If it was true, if he really carried Leland Thorne's blood, what good would running away do? A curse, if it truly existed, would not be limited by geography. It would follow him, like a shadow, to the ends of the earth. It would turn his life into a living hell, every night a nightmare, every day a fearful wait. And then, another emotion, stronger than fear, began to rise. The curiosity of a researcher. The stubbornness of someone who refuses to surrender to fate. He had to know who he really was. He had to understand the origin of this curse, its nature, its rules. This was the most horrifying socio-spiritual phenomenon he had ever encountered. Leaving now meant accepting a life lived in vague fear and the torment of an unsolved mystery. Staying, at least, gave him a chance to find the truth. Staying, at least, he could face it. Ethan's arms fell to his sides. He slumped onto the floor amidst the chaotic pile of his belongings. The internal struggle was fierce. Finally, he slowly took each item out of the backpack and folded it neatly. He had made his decision. Though terrified to his core, he would stay. When Maya brought breakfast, she nearly screamed when the door opened and she saw the 5 gruesome scratches on the wooden wall. Oh my God! What? What is this, Mr. Hayes? She dropped the basket of food, her face pale. Ethan was silent. His exhausted expression, the dark circles under his eyes, and his unervingly calm demeanor were the only answer she needed. Maya looked from the scratches to Ethan's dazed face, fear evident in her eyes. She understood this was no joke. Alara's vengeful spirit had truly come for him. She didn't ask any more questions, just quietly picked up the basket. You have to go see Elder Rowan, Maya said decisively after a long silence. Her voice no longer held its usual cheerfulness but was filled with gravity. Right now. Who is he? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. He's the last conjurer left in the hollow, the only one who still knows the old rites. He knows many things, things that ordinary people like us dare not speak of. Only he can explain what is happening to you. And only he can help you. The path to Elder Rowan's house was a steep trail leading to the highest point in the village, backed against a sheer limestone cliff. His cabin was small and old, nestled in nature as if it were part of the mountain itself. The higher they climbed, the thinner and colder the air became. Ethan felt as if he were entering another world, a place where earth and sky, the realm of humans and the realm of spirits, met. Elder Rowan was a thin, small old man, his face a canvas of deep wrinkles like carvings in stone, recording the passage of nearly a century lived amidst the mountain winds and mists. His skin was the color of the earth, and his eyes were small and clouded with age, but when he looked at someone, they shone with a strange, sharp, penetrating light. He was sitting on a low stool in front of his cabin, silently taking a long drag from a corncob pipe that was polished smooth with age. White smoke swirled around his weathered face, mingling with the morning mist that had not yet burned off. Maya approached, bowing her head respectfully, and said something in her dialect, her tone urgent and worried. Elder Rowan slowly raised his head, exhaling a plume of smoke. He squinted his sharp eyes, looking Ethan up and down. The old man's gaze made Ethan feel as if every thought, every fear in his mind was laid bare. City folk, the elder said in a raspy voice, his English accented but clear and powerful. Go home. This land doesn't welcome you. Sir, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady, also bowing his head. I came here to study the culture, but I've encountered some things I can't explain. I just want to understand the root of it. Understand? Elder Rowan chuckled, a gap-toothed smile revealing teeth stained from years of chewing tobacco. Some things are not for the living to understand. The more you know, the sooner you die. Seeing that the elder intended to dismiss them, Maya quickly interjected, this time pointing towards Ethan's cabin and making a motion with 5 fingers, clawing at the air. Elder Rowan's expression changed. The indifference vanished, replaced by a grave and concerned look. He stared at Ethan for a long moment, then silently nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the stool opposite. The old man quietly went inside his cabin and returned a moment later with an old leather pouch and a shallow wooden bowl. From the pouch, he carefully tipped out a collection of small animal bones and 3 smooth, dark river stones. These were his sacred instruments. He placed the bones and stones in the bowl. His mouth began to murmur ancient chants in his dialect, the low, strange sounds echoing in the still air. He closed his eyes, then suddenly shook the bowl vigorously. The bones and stones danced, making dry, clattering sounds. He cast them onto a worn piece of hide spread on the ground. After the first cast, he looked at the pattern they formed, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening. After the second cast, he shook his head slightly, a sigh escaping his chest. On the final cast, when the bones and stones lay still, Elder Rowan stared at them for a long time, then let out a heavy, weary breath. "Blood," he said, his voice low and firm. "The bones speak of blood. Old blood and new blood. A blood debt unpaid, a vengeful spirit unappeased." He looked up, directly into Ethan's eyes. "You didn't come here by chance, young man. You were called. The spirit of this land, the vengeful soul of Alara, it called you back here to pay the debt." "Pay the debt?" Ethan frowned. Despite being prepared, he was still stunned. "I don't understand." "You carry the blood of the one who caused it all," Elder Rowan said bluntly, without hesitation. "It smelled your blood the moment you set foot in Stone Creek Hollow. The twin soul blood oath is a living curse. It binds 2 souls together, one becomes a wraith, the other a demon. The wraith of Alara seeks revenge, while the spirit of Silas has become the demon that guards the oath. You are its newest debt." Ethan's ears were ringing. Twin soul blood oath. The blood of the one who caused it all. The words of the elder and Alara in his dream were converging into a terrible, undeniable truth. "But my last name is Hayes." "That man's was Thorn," Ethan argued weakly, clinging to the last shred of logic. Elder Rowan shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. "Names can be changed, but blood never changes. The blood flowing in your veins doesn't lie. The curse has recognized it. Now, you could run to the ends of the earth and it would find you. The only way is to stay here, understand it, and face it." With that, Elder Rowan offered no further explanation, just waved his hand for them to leave. He had said all that needed to be said. The rest was Ethan's choice. On the way back, Ethan walked like a man in a daze. Maya walked beside him, not daring to speak, only occasionally looking at him with worry. Elder Rowan's judgment hung over his head like a death sentence. Back at the cabin, Ethan collapsed into a chair, his mind reeling. He had to verify this. He couldn't accept such a horrifying truth based on a bone reading and a nightmare. He shakily pulled out his phone and found his grandmother's number in his contacts. She was the only one in the family who was still clear about the old family history, a living repository of information he often consulted for his research. The phone rang a few times before it was answered. "Hello, Ethan dear? Is something wrong? Are you still on your work trip?" His grandmother's warm, gentle voice came from the other end of the line, a sound from the normal, safe world that now felt so distant to Ethan. "Grandma, it's me," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice as normal as possible, but he could hear it trembling. "I'm in West Virginia. I wanted to ask you something about our family history." "West Virginia? What are you doing all the way out there, son?" "It's for a research project." "Grandma, I need to ask. Back in the day, did Grandpa, before he married you, ever work out in West Virginia?" There was a long silence on the other end, so long that Ethan thought the call had been disconnected. He could only hear his grandmother's faint sigh. "Why are you suddenly asking about that? That's ancient history." Her voice sounded different. "Please, just tell me, Grandma. This is really important," Ethan pleaded. Another pause. Finally, his grandmother spoke, her voice small and trembling, as if revealing a secret she had buried for a lifetime, a secret she never wanted to revisit. "Yes. Your grandfather, before he came back home, married me, and changed his name. He spent some time there as an agent for a mining company. He didn't go by Hayes back then. His birth name was Leland Thorne." The phone slipped from Ethan's hand, crashing onto the earthen floor and shattering the screen. Everything collapsed. Elder Rowan's words. Ilara's words in the dream. His grandmother's words. They all fit together perfectly, forming a horrifying picture of the truth. He, Dr. Ethan Hayes, a folklorist, an intellectual of the 21st century, was the great-grandson of Leland Thorne. The man who had used power and deceit to steal the love of Ilara Sparrow and Silas Crow. The man who had indirectly triggered the tragic blood oath, causing death and suffering that had lasted for over half a century. He wasn't an objective observer here to conduct research. He was part of the story. He was part of the blood debt. The curse hadn't found him by chance. It had found him because he was the one who had to pay.